And just before we start, I just want to let everyone know that the room is very strange acoustic, so that it amplifies a lot of noise that's made on the spot. So please just be mindful, everyone, of like any comments you're making during the round, because that's just going to be a lot louder than you're used to. And also, if you're speaking from there, you might have to speak a bit louder than you're used to, just because like, it's a little bit tired to do. So, can I first get the speak order of each team and any preferred plans?
John speaking first.
Robert second. Regis.
Stephen Douglas, masculine pronouns, please and thank you.
Mitch Ethan.
CG? Nick speaking first.
That's me. Speak up position first.
And I'll just read position as well. My name's Kate.
I'm closing opposition. I'm Ash. I'm on wet. My pronouns are they, them.
Dylan speaking first. Neutral first.
Alright, then I invite the Prime Minister to open the debate for your
Panel, individuals in a military system often live in a system of coercion. Whether they were coerced by the financial incentives given by recruiters or coerced by the very fact that the US Army commercials didn't give them the picture of what a war would look like when they actually got there. Therefore, we are going to propose that desertion at the end of a war effort ought to be pardoned by governments, by militaries, whatever institution can pardon the crime, those punishments will not accrue for those individuals. What does desertion look like in debate? This is individuals who, in conflict during the war effort, go missing in action or just quite literally put up their hands and say, I quit, I'm not going to fight anymore. If the sergeant tells me to do something, I'm not going to do it, right? Secondly, on the model, I'd like to say this is going to happen at the end of wartime. We think it's perfectly justified for the military to hold individuals who deserted in captivity until the end of wartime. We think this is so that they don't possibly do treason, so they don't possibly hurt themselves, so they don't possibly share secrets to the enemy, but they will be held ideally in just captivity where they are fed nicely, they are given a nice place to sleep. We think this is obvious, but the military will be justified in holding that captivity until the end of the war. Thirdly, we are only going to be pardoning desertion. If they do any kind of treason, sharing secrets with the enemy, during that, we are going to say they are still going to be punished for those crimes. First argument. Why do we think desertion is justified and pardoning is justified?
Right,
Three different scenarios. Sure.
Okay, so is this House America?
This house is America, but no, actually, I'd say like any state that has war efforts ought to do this. We're totally fine with it happening in any war. Okay, firstly, why desertion is justified and pardoning is therefore also justified. Three scenarios where we think desertion largely happens and why it's justified in each one. The first is in cases of conscientious objection. This is where individuals see unmoral things happening, things that go against their strict moral codes during wartime, such as like an individual who might have witnessed the My Lai massacre or something like that. Two reasons why we think it's justified for those individuals to desert in that kind of circumstance. One is because the war outcomes are no longer aligned with the outcomes that they signed up for, right? So if something happens in a war that they think is unjust, it's probably a fact when they signed up for the military, they signed up knowing that those kinds of things wouldn't happen. They signed up thinking that the US military is not the kind of military that rapes and massacres villagers, right? But then when they learn that that's not aligned anymore with what they had signed up for, we think they are justified in deserting that military effort where the leadership no longer accrues to what their kind of moral codes were when they signed up in the first place. But secondly, on outcomes analysis, outside of principle, we want people to be able to conscientiously object, right? We want individuals, when immoral things happen in a war, to be able to walk away and not feel like I might get punished later, and therefore stay with it and continue to help the machine with that kind of conscientious objection, right? Second scenario, we think individuals who are coerced in the military have a special justification for desertion, right? We think this largely happens through financial means. Like, United States is a good example of this, where recruiters often use financial incentives disincentives in order to get people into the military. I got a text 10 days ago from a recruiter who offered to pay for my college loans in order for me to go to the military. But this happens all the time. And recognize it's not just the poor people, but it's intersectional with minority communities as well. They go into these communities and they tell these individuals the only way for you ever to make it to get any kind of upward mobility is by joining the military. Then those individuals, when they join the military thinking it's going to get them money, they actually get on the ground and they recognize that it's not something that they were mentally aligned with, but they only chose it because they thought it was their only option for financial success. Why is it justified for them to leave? Because we think full assent to the action was not certain and they were uninformed about what they were going to get into because they didn't do the necessary research about what the military actions were because they were coerced by a financial incentive. Third scenario, right? This is the worst case scenario that Ott might want to materialize on. Individuals who just get scared and don't want to do it anymore. This is people who recognize what they were going to be doing, but once they actually get into it, once they see them see themselves blowing somebody else's head off, they get scared and say, I don't want to be in this military effort anymore. Two reasons we think it's justified for these individuals to desert. The first reason we think it is because having those kinds of individuals in the war effort is actually detrimental to the war effort. That is, having individuals who are shaking scared, no longer want to do it, are always telling their crewmates like, this sucks, this is stupid, is actually detrimental to the morale that exists in a war effort. But secondly, we think individuals quite literally don't know how war is going to affect them. They might think they're the kind of individual who can mentally stand up to shooting somebody in the face, but when they go actually do it, they learn that that wasn't the case. Therefore, we think it's justified for them to desert. POIs. Closing.
Yeah, so conscientious objective provisions are status quo in like any developed country's military, including the United States. There is a way that you can go through the military process and prove that you have a genuine objection to the war.
Yeah, I think that process is probably corrupt and probably not the best way, right? So you're going through a process with military leadership to conscientiously object to things that leadership might have told you to do, right? We don't think that even internal affairs works as well as people want it to do in those circumstances when they are buddy-buddy and oftentimes with the other kinds of leadership, right? We think that individuals are scared to kind of report those things because they recognize their leadership are the ones telling them to do the things that they conscientiously object to, especially in military structures where like loyalty to the leadership is seen in a kind of cultish manner. Why we don't think more people are going to desert on our side of the house, because that might come out from opposition, right? Firstly, because we think disincentives still exist for individuals not to desert, right? So we think a lot of the disincentives that will still exist is these kind of disincentives to abandoning your fellows, abandoning the defense of your country, right? So if those are important things to you, we think that those individuals still won't desert, right? But we also think the fact that quite a few people deserted anyway shows that the fact that having legal ramifications for desertion wasn't that big of a disincentive in the first place. We think in all three of our scenarios that we just outlined, people would have deserted probably anyway if they got too scared that if they were conscientiously objected or being cursed in the military, so we might as well not punish them for it. Third argument. This is important. We think we allow individuals to return to their countries after they have seen something bad in wartime and then tell those stories and start revising histories and actually creating truth and reconciliation after a large war, right? So if you conscientiously object and you don't go through the proper procedures that closing opposition outlined to you, you are scared to ever go back to your home country or talk to people back in your home country because you're scared to face persecution. Why do we think this is specifically a bad thing? Because we want people who witnessed immoral actions in war to be able to go back into their countries and say, these were the people that told me to do this. This is what actually happened in the war. We think this is how we start systematically breaking down cover-ups that exist in military institutions, right? When individuals can go to the media and say, this is what happened, we get the people moving to hold those individuals accountable, right? We think this was individuals who came back from the war effort in Vietnam and were able to say, this is what was happening, and then that actually started mobilizing communities to say, let's get out of the war. And it wasn't until people started picketing that we actually saw the war being accountable because we were losing it basically the whole time anyway, right? We think there's already individuals who do this who are within the war effort, but we think we get those individuals that were so scared of these kinds of desertion laws that they never came back to their countries to actually come back and share that information. We think in the vast majority of occasions, desertion is principally justified. We don't think that many more people are going to desert. We're still going to have war efforts in our side of the house, and we actually get truth and reconciliation for those individuals who saw terrible atrocities in war.
So war is hell. This isn't something we're going to contest. We are aware that when these people enter these situations, it is something that is often life-changing. It is something that is very effective, but it is also something that is often necessary for the state to function, and necessary for the state to function. It is something that, like, even the strongest of wills who can actually go through it, it is something that they will continuously question as they're going through their entire existence, and it is something that they will be constantly asking themselves as they're going through this war process. But this does not stop the fact that war is often a necessary construction for the state to remain safe. This does not stop the fact that in order for campaigns and in order for the institution of war to remain effective in any sort of manner, that it needs to keep this integrity. As Closing Up has already brought up, there are already systems in place for conscientious objectors to escape it. We can expand this by bringing about the idea where it's like you can even consciously object to do even specific roles. Even if you just like object to killing, you can still play a part in logistics. You can still play a part in like medicine. You can still play a part in a variety of different things a variety of different things. So not only can you go through a system where you can opt out of that process entirely, you can go through it even if you even object to very specific parts of the process. Yes.
Yeah, how can you preemptively object to a massacre that hasn't yet happened? Like, presumably the Vietnam War was objectable because of the foreign policy goals that it pursued, but people didn't know that My Lai was going to happen. What systems do you have to account for that?
Well, okay. So for the system, okay, but the system we have to account for that are kind of partly fulfilled where it's like you can raise awareness when you do come back to home after you consciously object, where you can still take part in that revisionist in that revision that you guys are talking about, and a lot of Vietnam deserters in the status quo remain as part of that. So you still kind of get that sort of reconciliation in the status quo. But I'll be moving on. Okay, so we're going to be moving on to our main 3-4. So like, how this disincentivizes loyalty and is a fundamental threat to the success of military campaigns in general, and B, how sometimes violence is necessary to protect not only people abroad but also people within your own country, as well as the soldiers that you're often fighting alongside, and 3, how since you're in a military unit, you often have like a moral obligation to play the role that you are assigned, and to play the role that they often depend on in order to survive on a day-to-day basis during this campaign. Okay, so we're going to have this disincentivizes loyalty. So as I've already gone through in my opening, like war is often something that is extremely difficult to go through. We're not contesting this, but we're saying that since it's very difficult to go through, that every single person in the military is always going to be constantly questioning themselves, and it's going to be constantly wanting to go out, even if they do believe in it, and even if they do want to see it succeed. So what this means is what this necessarily means that even though these people are capable and they will be able to like successfully perform their functions, if they know that they can get out, they can get out of it, and that they won't be prosecuted when it ends up ending, even people that would be able to tough it out and would be able to go it out, because they've questioned it, they will take this incentive when they otherwise wouldn't have, and we believe that this means that like positions won't be filled in the military campaigns, which fundamentally threatens the ability for the state to prosecute its wars and defend its citizens, and we believe that this often puts soldiers in harm's way, which you'll emphasize at the closing.
So you seem to be, like, I think first of all, opening kind of already preempted this argument very effectively, and second of all, like, is it so bad that soldiers won't have to be put through war again? I need some unique harms for, like, there not being enough soldiers to fight in war.
Okay, so that'll go into my second point, which answers that question, is that violence is often necessary to protect the state and its people. Okay, so I can give you really obvious examples, like coercion was necessary to keep soldiers in World War II to keep fighting for as long as possible, so that they would be able to defend their country, even if the soldiers didn't necessarily want to. But I'm going to bring about a lot more nuanced examples with things like say like terrorist organizations who actively attacking the United States or actively attacking different members. And in order to keep these institutions from building up and being even stronger, you have to go and strike at the source of like where they're being created. And we believe that the only way we can achieve this is to put boots on the ground, to create an actual attacking mechanism against them in order to keep these institutions that are fundamentally working to harm your citizens, to harm your state, as well as the people around them. In order to make sure that these institutions don't become stronger is to commit violence. And we believe that this is something that needs to be as effective as possible in order to guarantee the government's number one concern, which is the protection of its citizens. And in order to do this, some level of coercion is necessary, although we've already gone to like how people can object to it and how people can get out of it if they so please through currently existing systems. And to go on to that point on like a more like intimate level, like the fellow soldiers that you're with in day-to-day operations often depend on you to do very important jobs in order to keep them alive. This could represent itself in terms of like logistics, where you're like giving ammo that they need in order to fight off enemies. This could represent itself in like being a medic and like keeping people alive. This could represent itself as literally just covering someone's flank to make sure no one sneaks around them and shoots them. In order for like units to be effective, they need the full amount of personnel in order to cover. And if during halfway through a campaign, someone decides to desert because they're more incentivized to do so under this motion, this means that like units across the board are not going to have the support that they need, which means the soldiers that they've sworn an oath to and they've kind of formed a brotherhood or like a fellowship to defend are now going to be at higher risk of being killed, injured, or maimed, or seriously hurt throughout the campaign, which means that when a deserter leaves, that means that they're being fundamentally harmed. And we believe that this is why it's right to prosecute. It's because by deserting, the harm which you want to prevent is already being done, and the harm still exists, whether or not it happened before or after the war. So since the harm is still done, we should still prosecute to prevent that harm from being done, and that's why it will be unjust to stop desertions from happening. Thank you.
Two conversations to have. First, a conversation about consent and the presumption of just outcomes. Second of all, talk about how we change war, talk about how we change the conversation and give people back democratic control over unjust wars that are being pursued by their own tax dollars. First, on principles. John gave you a pretty good reason as to why people have the right to be pardoned by this as a result of things like conscientious objection. They are war crimes that are committed before they consented to sign a contract with the military that said they were going to pursue, as the opening opposition very generously frames us, a war of justice and a war of self-defense. It is the underestimation of trauma, which is to say that as soon as you sign up for a war, it's unclear whether or not you might be impacted by certain things over more. Like simply seeing another soldier fall down during battle might be enough to send you into shock in a way that you are unable to pursue the war effort in a way that might actually endanger other individuals. They are coercive tactics like the military, going into communities of color and saying, I'm going to save you from destitute and poverty by bringing you into the military and putting you on the front lines, which is often what happens the most. The response we got from the opening opposition was laughable. They said there's a process for objection. Then we give a POI that said you can't preemptively consent to a war that is unjust if the unjust actions haven't happened yet, and they kind of fumbled around and said, well, there's the process and we'll figure out the process, and quite literally, I didn't understand the response. We still needed an answer from the DLO. I suspect it won't happen, so back half, let's engage on it. Then they said that you can do non-war things. Look, two responses here. First, doing something like contributing to intel, even plugging in SD cards so that intel can be shared with other communities and other countries and military experts, even contributes to the bombing of certain individuals in certain regions in a way that still is going to kill people, which is something that you consciously objected to in the first place. But let's take them at their best. Let's assume you're sweeping the floors of a Coast Guard ship. That is still tacitly contributing to a war effort that is funded by your own tax dollars, which means that the government cannot force you to do it. That is the entire purpose of the principle of conscientious objection, is that any participation is a tacit endorsement of unjust activity. Then they say war is a necessary construction of the state. 3 responses. First, this is an awful principle because it gives governments the ability to instrumentalize the public for injustice using their own tax dollars. I need a justification as to why that is an okay thing insofar as that forces people to contradict their own moral conceptions of how the world should be without their consent. Second of all, it was not, I would completely disagree with your conception of how war works, and this might be a bit controversial, but I don't think most wars are for self-defense. I think they are pursued as a result of profit, incentivized by the military-industrial complex. I think they are pursued in pursuit of foreign policy goals that are used like through mechanisms like bombing the hell out of Yemen and supporting Saudi Arabia. They are doing things like sending troops to recolonize states that were liberated in the 1960s. They are unjust mechanisms by which the state exerts its own control over countries that aren't able to fight back, rather than protecting the borders of the state. World War II, you've got no justification. The rest of it, I think of it an awful series of interventions by the United States and the developed world. You need to justify those on your side of the house. But then we got a DWAH from the background that I think was a pretty good response, which is that you need to prove how one person objecting, even 5 people objecting, is going to magically deconstruct the war effort in a way that gets thousands and thousands of people killed. Even if that happens on our side of the house, we support that because you force them into that situation through a system of coercion and manipulation in a way that they could not consent to, which means you can't make excuses for them. You have to give them a pardon, right? Then they say that, oh, well, people are going to leave because they have no incentive for loyalty, ignoring the preemptive response that we got from John. Lots of reasons as to why people are going to do this. The reason John gave you is because they still have respect for the mission, even though they don't want to participate in itself, right? There's a command structure in the military that foments social cohesion in a way that people aren't going to leave the war effort if they legitimately think it's going to harm their platoon. That leads me to the second reason as to why they won't object, if that's not enough for your non-responsive engagement, which is that people make friends with other people in the military. There is a sense of brotherhood and compassion for the people who are around you, who don't want to see them killed, which means that you're going to have a very high bar as an individual for being a conscientious objector or leaving or deserting whatever's going to happen on our side of the house, right? The objectors will happen when circumstances are absolutely dire. And even if they don't, even if people die, we support that because it still means that you're putting that individual on the front line and instrumentalizing them for injustice, which we say is unacceptable as a government. It's unacceptable as a world of compassion, and it is a world that is supposed to be moral. We need responses, otherwise you're losing on the very reason as to why we're having this debate in the first place. If that's enough for you, not enough for you, let's talk about how we change war. Any POIs? Nothing?
Cool, can I say something?
Sure.
Okay, so before going into a war, deserters are people who left who are already deployed. Before that, you get a briefing, extensive military training, people recognize that war means trauma. You can consent to this and know this. Just because you are traumatized does not mean that a crime is pardoned.
2 responses. First, these good briefings depend on the military being productive, being cohesive, being structured in a way that they're delivering accurate briefings. The United States might be a good example, but all around the world, I would say that lots of countries that are desperate for recruits mislead individuals as to what the war effort is going to look like because they need people to fight battle. Look at the United States after 9/11. They desperately needed people to come onto the war, but they couldn't because no one wanted to join a war that was unjust, so they lowered the standards and manipulated people into joining the war in a way that coerced them into coming on. But even if that's not true, it doesn't matter whether or not they brief them, because I could say, oh, well, yes, I'm going to see bloodshed, I'm going to see really awful things, but you don't know how that's going to affect you until it happens when it's happening. Very simple principle of consent that the supposedly liberal debate community is supposed to understand. Just because you consent to something first doesn't mean you can't change your mind when the circumstances change later. Very simple thing for you to engage with. So, let's talk about changing war here. John tells you something extremely important, which is that when these people go public and they blow the whistle, they're able to do a couple of things, right? Not only are they allowed to testify, they can do things like write op-eds in the Washington Post or the local newspaper about what happened to them. They can go to Congress and testify and say, we are committing war crimes in Yemen, we are committing acts of starvation, quite similar to how we did in Vietnam, and it's time to do something about it. These people like Bo Bergdahl often go public on the news. What happens then? You change the conversation, because once people start realizing what is happening as a result of the quite literal Truth and Reconciliation Commission that is created implicitly as a result of people going public, you create pressure from the public. The media has got all eyes on you while you tell your story. What does that mean? That means the public now has the power to stop their government from committing unjust wars, because everyone knows what is going on. The pursuit of truth is not an in and of itself. It is not a reason to affirm this motion. The pursuit of truth is a way by which we recognize our own pursuit of democracy and the knowledge that we share to make democratic decisions over who we elect, but not only who we elect, but what decisions they make, and those decisions include war. The only way that you get to that is by instrumentalizing information so that we have as much knowledge about what is going on as possible. The only way to do that is to be able to give someone a retroactive, principled right to be pardoned from a war that they did not consent to, did not want to be a part of, and wanted to leave, and when they blow the whistle, that's going to result in all sorts of outcomes. But even if none of those happen on our side of the house, even if people shame them, even if people send them into the darkness and tell them to go back home, you committed treason against their country, they still have the principled right to do so, which is enough to affirm the motion.
Where a lot of some echoes, please just be quiet, make the rounds, so we can hear the speakers. Thank you. Now call upon Deputy Leader of the Opposition to close out the front half of the debate.
In order for your legitimacy on the international stage to be respected, you need to establish your own sovereignty. The only way to do that is to establish a military force that is strong enough to actually protect yourself and strong enough to show to others that you have legitimacy over force within your nation and to use elsewhere. We think it's important for this to exist, and we think that if you allow people just to be able to desert, you're reducing the loyalty in the military to a far greater extent than what they're trying to portray the picture as. And we also think that this delegitimizes your military on the international stage, and you lose your power. We think that to respond to the fact that you need to be able to uphold the military on their actions to exist, we think that exists on both sides. Because their example is Vietnam, where people stayed in the war, yet people still know that it exists, right? People still know that atrocities in Vietnam still happen, even though they still prosecuted deserters. We get that on both sides of the house, therefore it's not relevant in the round. We think that overall, we think that on the moral consciousness side, that first of all, we still have conscientious objectors first of all. For example, there was the one during World War II, the conscientious objector that was able to actually receive the Medal of Honor because he was still able to do good, while still objecting to the actions the military was taking without taking up a gun in the first place. We also think that even when you sign up to the military, you take an obligation to sign up for the government and sign up for the services, to put aside what you think is right and wrong and believe that what you're being told. We think that you have to take the stance that that even in some circumstances where I think that something's maybe wrong, I need to trust in my government and trust in my people, the elected officials on my side, that what I am doing is morally right? That what I am doing is the best decision for my people or the best decision in the people that I'm at. Yes?
Yeah, so Vietnam happened because of the Pentagon Papers, which were people blowing the whistle because no one could come out about what was happening in Vietnam. This is the same exact principle.
We think that but the principle applies in pretty much every single war, right? Over time in history, as we see, every single war we are able to see the atrocities that happen. We think that this happened in Korea. We think this happens in pretty much every war that occurs, right? The atrocities eventually come out, and people find out what happens in these types of scenarios. Again, whether you restrict people from being able to be deserters or not, because whether you're a deserter or not, we still think that there's people that are going to maintain within the war that eventually come back and are still able to tell people about the atrocities that exist on both sides of the house, and therefore it is relevant. So, what do we tell you? We tell you that so the individuals still there's still soldiers that are returning home and telling their stories of what happened. Therefore, these stories still get out, and everyone is still aware of what happened in the war. It's not relevant in this round. We think that. And then on the contrary, you put aside your moral code because you need to take the stance that what you believe is right. Whether you think is right or wrong, that morally you have a duty to uphold that your government is doing what's right and wrong, especially if you come in a government that is a democratic government or what have you, that the elected officials are doing what's best for the public interest, what's doing best for you. So going into our constructive, we think that first of all, that this delegitimizes loyalty. Why is this important? This is important because on the international stage, the only thing you need is your sovereignty, right? You need to be able to show everyone that you have control over your government. You need to be able to control your citizens, that under your territory, you have the right to govern yourself. Well, how do you do that? You need military force. You need to have a monopoly on the actual use of force within the state or use of force elsewhere to tell other people that if you come after us, that we are able to do this. We need to be able to have this active force. We think that if you legitimize, if you allow people to disagree with this and basically go against your military, as Stephen pointed out, a lot of people think this, right? There's oftentimes in any war, a lot of people are going to question the rightness or wrongness of war, right? We think they underestimate the number of people that are actually questioning this, and they don't do it for the harms of the fact that they can be prosecuted or other harms that exist on our side of the house. We think that if you do this, then a lot more people will think that this is bad, and therefore they won't continue to go afterwards, right? And this is harmful because then this overall reduces your ability ability to manage the government as a whole. We also think this delegitimizes yourself as a state by saying that we are allowing people that do not do what we want. We are allowing people that went against what we think is right for the people to say all of a sudden say that it's okay to go around. This delegitimizes your ability as a state to have control over the state itself, which then reduces your ability both domestically and internationally to maintain your sovereignty and maintain your international rights. No, thank you. So, what do we think? Secondly, we think that this sort of like dependency, right? We think there's three types of people that depend on you. We think there's multiple different scenarios and where war is necessary. We've already proved this. Yes, we agree that bad wars happen and people do things that aren't necessarily true. However, we also think there's plenty of scenarios where war is necessary, and the fact that they admitted that World War II is necessary for a lot of states perfectly legitimizes that. There's a number of different scenarios where war is perfectly acceptable means to use this type of force. We also think that we can't necessarily stop. We also think that we can't necessarily stop war from happening with this type of scenario. We think it'll still happen because it's been happening for thousands of years, right? So, what do we tell you? We say that first of all, you have the loyalty to your fellow soldiers. Even if just the number of times that these states, they often plan anything that they do, right? They have strategic coordinations that rely on the exact number of individuals going into a system, and going into any sort of scenario, right? If one removes, and that scenario is then completely uprooted, and things can go wrong, and a lot of people can die. We think that we get more lives lost in a war on our side of the house, which inherently gives us the moral upper hand. We think that secondly, on the side of the soldier, not just soldiers, but your own internal citizens. We think that the people within your state are relying on you to do what you think what's best, because the people in the state may think that this is best for their internal income. We think that states sometimes do get invaded and need to be able to protect themselves, and therefore if you desert, if your state is holding a war, then it is necessary for you to be able to protect yourself, and the citizens within your state are reliant on that. They need you to be able to actively engage in other soldiers, and if you leave, you could potentially be leading to the loss of life or the domination of your state and your individuals. So thank you. So, what do we tell you then? We tell you that thirdly, there's three different types of people. We think that sometimes war is necessary to go to other places. If we think that bad states are committing genocide or war crimes against other individuals, then it's necessary for us to step in and say, protect the citizens that can't protect themselves in those scenarios. We think that we have a responsibility that if you abandon, you can be leading to the death of a lot of innocent civilians in other states, which is not necessarily what we want. Yes?
It's unclear to me why three people objecting to a war and dropping out is going to destroy the credibility of the military, given the fact that defenders have happened.
Yeah. Okay, so as they keep saying that 3 or 4 or 5 individuals. First of all, there's often plenty of individuals that abandon during that desert on these types of scenarios because they can't, for many different reasons. But secondly, we've already provided a mechanism that the psyche of most soldiers is that they often question what they're doing is right or wrong. Therefore, if there's a very large, almost all of the soldiers are doing this, and they actually have an out to do it, this is much larger on the scale than 3 or 4. We think you could possibly be getting hundreds of people that are saying that we don't agree with what's happening, and this severely delegitimizes your ability. If hundreds of soldiers are saying we don't agree with you and what we're doing, this could lead to thousands or what have you, right? This is much larger than just a couple individuals. This can have a severe impact on your ability to govern. So, what do you tell you? We tell you that. So the third way is that some people do actively sign up to this, and then they provide a contractual obligation to fill out their side. This is what I was already telling you. We think that when you sign up to be a part of the military, that you often have an obligation to put aside what you think is morally right or wrong, and go what the people, the elected officials within your state, think that is right or wrong for you. Because you have an obligation to protect not only the soldiers that are within your state, to protect them from dying, because you have built this bond with them. So you have an obligation to protect them, you have an obligation to protect your own citizens, and you have an obligation to protect the people in other states, while also maintaining, and it's also important for the state to maintain the loyalty so that it has both domestic and international sovereignty and respect on those scales. And this is all important, and we have less slides left in our subtitles.
I think that speaker now call upon the member of government to open back after debate.
We hear from the last speaker that a couple of things very well summarized, in that governments need militaries to wage constant warfare of some sort. A military is so weak that it can be crippled by deserters, and that militaries are necessary for statecraft, and there's a mass mythology that people will desert. We'll get rid of all of these things. First, we think that the necessity of military for statecraft is interesting. It's not unique, though, to the topic. We think that we can still maintain average militaries while having policies that best benefit the people in those militaries and precarious positions. We think the analysis also forgets the great example of the 20th century of creating global liberal institutions that decrease the likelihood of mass warfare in the first place. We also think that issues like the current G20 summit suggest that when our world leaders can come and sit together and talk in light of global institutions, that the mass warfare that would necessitate their kind of mass atrocities and numbers just goes away. We also think that there's a mass mythology that people are going to be deserting constantly, and that this mass desert will cripple the military. We have a couple of responses to this. One, insofar as military is now non-conscriptive, the majority of them, people are actively buying into systems that on some level, at least in the beginning, they wanted to be a part of. This means that people are not being forced into systems that they're just waiting to leave. They're buying into systems that they want to be a part of on some level, meaning that desertion only happens in various scenarios, likely when it's justified and warranted. We think that even if people, if you don't buy that, even if people are deserting in mass, we think if people are leaving in mass numbers, it's probably because the military is doing something really, really shitty, and that's also not any type of benefit that they can get to their side, flow to our side. Okay, we also think that there's a basic counterfactual, that the affirmative world is trying to create a policy that would open windows for people to be leaving in masses for ununique or no reason at all. This is a counterfactual. What's actually happening is that in status quo, there are current people who have avid reasons to leave, good reasons, warranted reasons to want to step out and unconsent from a system necessarily. And what actually does is buy into systems that would allow policies like this to be created. Okay, go ahead.
When there's a justice system that already exists and you think that justice system is still unfair and you've exhausted everything and you want to simply disobey, there is a way to do that. It is called taking your punishment and serving your time. That is what we accept in civil disobedience in all kinds of cases.
Okay, we show you that because of the way superiors work, oftentimes in military cases, this becomes A, unfeasible for most people, and B, inaccessible to groups that are in precarious positions. Think people in the military who are victims of sexual assault and who are transgender or non-gender binary. Your mode of privilege is very easily inaccessible to a certain type of individual in the military, and even that doesn't always work. Okay, going forward, what is the framework? We think that the majority of individuals' rights now are very diverse from military life, from understanding the way the military works. In fact, a recent Pew Research Center poll demonstrates that only about 1 to 3% of individuals know somebody who is actively engaged in active duty. This means that we have a change from the Vietnam War scenario, where the public does not have an avid eye on what the military is doing. The public and the military are now two separate systems. Insofar as systems of mass conscription go away, the public has no incentive to buy into the military as a power structure of their own investment. The people in the military have to do it as a matter of their own investment as those who are actively deployed. We're going to create systems that give people in the military power. Okay, what do we bring you? First, positive matter. The model is necessary to give tools to survivors of sexual assault, and we'll demonstrate this point in a couple of ways. First, understand the harm. That right now, anywhere from 17 to 22% of individuals in the military who are women and non-gender binary are the victims of sexual assault. Because of an era of toxic masculinity that runs rampant in the system where we give large men rewards for being large men who have guns, we think that the military is directly an area that oftentimes is susceptible to things like toxic masculinity and violence amongst individuals and interpersonal violence. We think that it's an area where people who extend OG's analysis about people who are in precarious positions being pushed into, we think these individuals are oftentimes targets and have found themselves saturated in an area that makes them targets for sexual assault. We think that the way superiors work and the contextualization means that you often can't go to your superiors and support things accurately or get the benefits that you need. You then find yourself actively deployed in an area where you are now the victim of sexual assault, the survivor of sexual assault, and also at the same time trying to survive in a war. You are all at once on the receiving end of systematic violence and then being asked for a country that won't support you in your time of sexual assault to reap violence on their behalf. We think that desertion is oftentimes not just a tool but a necessary resort for individuals who find themselves in precarious positions of sexual assault, and that right now those that find themselves in intersectional positions cannot use main avenues. But if we allow policy creation where people know that yes, there is not the best avenue for you to do this, but you can opt out, you can desert, we will keep you in a contract, but that's also not that bad. We'll talk about that, and then afterwards you get redress for these issues. Also, cross-apply OG's analysis about how we get more active voices. When we specifically talk about sexual assault survivors and we bring them back to our forefront, those are the stories that OG tells you about. The stories about rampant change that cannot happen because after a post-Vietnam era, we no longer have investment into the military as a public. It is then on the barebone of those in the military to invest in themselves. Our policies don't allow them to do that. The solvency is this, that desertion uniquely allows for a system to scapegoat superiors who aren't there to help you in the first place, to bring back stories to home of what the real atrocity is happening. And while you're in protection of the US as a deserter waiting for the war to win, you also have access to services that people who are military tribunals would also get. The real issue of consent that OG wants to talk to you about, that we're going to extend, is a true issue of consent. One in which you are not being respected in these systems. One in which your body is literally on the line to be on the receiving end of unwanted attention and unwanted bullets. In which your only route for redress is desertion, not because it's something that's plausible, but because it's something that's necessary. We ought to make it plausible for that very reason. We can see that this also allows for things like internal reform, when people in the military, if they do mass desert, like the mythology that we want to get happening from opening opposition, will realize, why are people in the military mass deserting? Insofar as Kate and I bring you the framework that the military no longer has an eyesight direction with the public because of post-Vietnam War era military policy, people in the public don't have an incentive to invest in military policy. We get to throw the military away in our eyes. We get to send them to Iraq and Afghanistan to fight our wars for us, and to wage proxy wars in Latin America, and not know their names, or who they are, what the numbers are, or what they look like. That then means that individuals in the military have no eye back home that's actively advocating for them. Don't believe me? Look at current veteran policy in the US right now. People in the military do not have those back home who are fighting for them. They need tools to fight for themselves, insofar as we have political redress that won't ever account for them. We give people in precarious situations the tools to invest in themselves. When the military can specifically create a policy itself that tells the people, we realize we are a fucked up institution at time, and we give you access to avenues that will allow you to leave us when we need to. That's important.
That speaker now call upon member of opposition for the very case here.
It's funny that in a roundabout pardoning people for something that has happened in the military, the idea that the military actually has a justice system, has an actual court system, military court martials, has defense lawyers, has prosecutors, has procedural fairness, and has a process, has hardly come up at all. I gave this to the government speakers in the very first speeches, and they said yada yada yada, it's corrupt, it's like calling HR. We're going to tell you why that's bullshit. So, our extension is going to be on how the military justice system is actually reasonably fair, or at least as fair as it can be given the inherent needs of the military and the trade-offs that it has to make to preserve the sovereignty of a nation. We're going to explain to you how desertion subverts that and fundamentally just erodes and destroys the authority of the military and its ability to effectively wage conflicts that the polity has determined are just or are necessary for the nation. And we're going to talk about how ultimately the result you get on this side is actually a lot more desertion than side government thinks, and you get a situation of choose your war, where instead of elected officials, instead of people who are informed and are assessing the situation in the best interest of the people, you have individual soldiers making their off-the-cuff decisions on whether they feel like going into this war. So we'll be going through all of that. First, to just preliminarily respond to some of the stuff we've heard on front half. So we think they talked about ineffective soldiers and the scared soldiers are going to be ineffective. So they would have sucked anyway. We think commanders have an inherent strong interest in making sure their soldiers are effective. And if somebody is a basket case, they're going to assign that person to places where that person can be more effective or do less harm or that kind of thing. Military commanders can manage this kind of thing. And we think that is something that if the military system takes seriously, if you are in a psychological trauma situation where you can't function effectively in that role, right? The military also has an interest in this. They talked about Vietnam War vets and that stuff a lot. We say that fundamentally, I also flagged this in a POI. We think that the public doesn't really respect deserters that much. The public, to the extent it knows about war, knows that just leaving your army is unpatriotic and kind of sneaky in general is what their reaction is going to be to those people. So we think the public much more respects people who do their time, serve in the military, and actually come back and tell stories. That's how Vietnam got done, right? And also Vietnam was a case of conscription too. So we don't necessarily have to defend conscription on our side of the house. We're defending the typical case where Western democracies recruit people voluntarily. So okay. Also, we think that we also just think that this can happen. You respect people who did that, you also can respect like civil, like conscientious objectors, right? Like people flouting the law is the best way to demonize them. See people like Edward Snowden, where like the number one thing is like, yeah, you ran away, like you had an objection, but you weren't willing to take the punishment that goes along with that objection. We think the public respects these deserters a lot more when they come from a place of having having gone through the process, having made their stand and had their day. So finally, we get this extension about sexual assault. We do take this seriously. This is a serious, genuine problem in the military, right? We think that it's something that's really come to light a lot, and that's something that is being like publicly criticized, and that commissions are being created for, and that like processes are being put in place to try and address and ameliorate. It's a difficult thing to solve in any institution, and we think that the military is starting to work on that. We think that there's a couple things here. We think first, like if you're a sexual assault complainant in the military, your odds of being able to actually like get asylum in another state if you really need to like are higher. We also just think that like generally speaking, what this does is it ultimately means that pressure for change in the military for all the people who can't desert or just don't have the means or like can't pull it off for whatever reason is diminished, because there are like fewer people there who have solidarity, who you like fellow officers that have had that experience that you can talk to, or that you can or that you can have solidarity with, or people who will push for change, or people who will keep your back. So we think this just makes the situation worse for everyone who doesn't leave. So, moving on. We say the military justice system exists and like is actually a decent system, right? Western liberal democracies have the rule of law. They recognize that they are putting people in life or death situations, and the military typically has, in most Western liberal democracies, states included, a court system where like literal independent military judges are deciding these kinds of things, whether you are a conscientious objector, whether it was okay for you to disobey that order to fire on civilians or something like that. And like oftentimes they even like have actually really good process and are actually known for that. Like they pay like defense lawyers to like represent soldiers in those situations and make sure that they get a fair hearing, because they take seriously the life or death kind of situation that they operate in every day.
So even if we had a perfect military justice system that allowed everybody who consciously objected or sexually assaulted to get proper recourse, we give you reasons why even individuals who are just coerced by financial incentives or just got scared because they didn't recognize how they mentally respond also should be justified.
So we say that like this is an unsolvable problem in the military to some extent, right? Like we don't defend like the shoddiest of recruiting processes, but we think generally speaking, like yes, the military can recruit adults with like contracts that are like known in advance, and like generally speaking, we think this consent is like kind of misnomer on their side of the house. Like we think people know what war is, right? We think people know that war is kind of shitty. Like we think there's a lot of popular culture about that. We think that like war is pretty well known to be a thing where you kill people and it is traumatic and it is unpleasant, and that like people making that choice give a kind of broad consent that they necessarily have to give, right? Because the military doesn't know what wars it's going to be fighting in advance. It doesn't know its future needs. But it must react when something happens. So if the country gets attacked tomorrow, they have to have an army in place that can act on that is not going to be paralyzed, that is not going to freeze. So, we say that, like, this is how the military justice system does have to be, and that it balances that as best it can. We think that the military needs to be able to carry out the will of a sovereign people, and that, like, when the president threatens war on a country, he needs to be able to know that, like, I can actually pull that off, and I'm not going to have, like, 8 or 10% of my soldiers start trying to desert, and, like, seriously compromise my ability to actually effectively wage a campaign against you. We say that like command, also we say this is partly so because command has more information in the military, right? Like command knows more about the war, about the nature of the war, and like what will or will not cause harm, right? Like the command knows better than you whether you leaving is going to hurt your squad mates, because command knows more about what kind of deployments it's going to put them on, what kind of strategic factors are coming in. There's an information imbalance that means you do have to trust your commander to some extent to like have a functioning military, and that like people can unknowingly endanger each other. Desertion subverts this system, right? Because we think it sends a long-run signal that like if you hide out for a couple years until like the military campaign goes away and then come back, nothing happens, right? It means that the military's authority is weak, and that like you can, and under their system even you can like decide you'd rather sit in a room and just like literally make that decision and do it under their system where you're like detained under good conditions. So like it makes it really, really easy to quit the war. Why is this result in a system of choose your war? We think this shifts the decision from elected leaders and command to an individual level. We actually think way more people leave than they think, right? Because like there's a lot of reasons, right? People get homesick. You have to be away from the military. You have to be away from home and your family for years. Life events happen outside. Maybe you get like accepted to like a college or something, or like you have some kind of opportunity back home that you want to go pursue. People dislike the conditions because military is like a hard job and shitty, and you have to like get up really early and work really hard, and it's like really unpleasant. Also, like people sometimes join banking on the fact that there won't be a war, and they think that like they know they take that on that obligation, but they don't think they're actually going to have to do it, and then they decide they don't want to do it when it actually happens. That is totally fine under their model because you can just join and then desert as soon and then desert if you don't like how things turn out. We think that the success odds of the war are tied to how many people desert, right? Like if you get 4 or 6 or 8 or 10% of your soldiers starting to desert or not show up for work, like you actually do have a really hard problem making a war. Also just political disagreement, like people just like, oh, I think the Iraq war is bad because like I think Bush is a dick and it was a bad idea, right? Like that's not a conscientious objection, but it's a reason someone would leave. So we say to you that actually what this leads to is a situation where instead of the people, instead of the country, a sovereign nation deciding when to fight a war, the soldiers take a referendum on it in the barracks. We don't like that system.
Take that speaker and call on the government to close up the gov bench. Here, here.
What my partner and I would posit to you is that the most important stakeholder in this debate is not the countries, it is not the people in the countries, it is the soldiers themselves. So we think if we can improve things for the soldiers themselves, we think if we can prove that this is the most just way to treat soldiers in society, then Gov ought to win, specifically closing government. I'm going to crystallize this debate for you using 3 questions. First, the top half debate. Does desertion harm countries? No. Question 2, what we just get from the member of opposition. Are current military justice processes enough? No, absolutely not. The question that we get from Nicholas's debate, wow, I always call him Nick, so weird. Do countries owe this to soldiers? We think the answer is indubitably yes. All right, so going on to question number 1. Does desertion harm countries? We think that opening government does a fabulous job on this debate, right? They tell you like why desertion could be justified. They give you 3 great reasons, none of them which we think are like really pushed back on well by opposition. Then they talk to you about how like people can return to countries and tell their stories and like it can get accountability for the harms of war. We think that Nick extends this with his analysis when he says like, yeah, the harms of war go beyond like just war crimes. They also go to the harms that we perpetuate to soldiers themselves. And when we disengage from soldiers as a whole, which we've done because we don't have the draft anymore, so only select people who have selected into the soldiers care about them anymore, then we don't hear those soldiers nearly enough. Then quote, opening government tells you like wars like that are inherently unjust. We think those are the only wars where you're going to get this like worst case scenario that they give you up and down opposition bench about like so many people are going to desert that like suddenly we don't have an army. We think that first of all the deputy government tells you and then Nick reinforces for you like why this is only going to happen in cases of unjust wars, and we think that's like an inherent benefit to society if we can say like if there's an unjust war, the soldiers are able to dissent without worrying about like having to spend their lives in prison or something like that. So we think that overall like Nick shows why opening government is right about everything in this debate, and he shows you like more directly why the mechanism of pardon like legitimates veterans in the eyes of the public and gets them the support that they deserve because of the harms they have incurred through war. So basically the response that you get from the opening opposition is kind of like violence can be necessary and at times to protect countries, and what we say to that and what Nick tells you is like yes, but individuals shouldn't have to perpetuate that violence, especially when it's a thankless tax, right? If it is to protect people as they say, then why not allow soldiers to protect themselves and their mental health and desert if they need to? So then basically the other thing that we mainly get out of opening government is like people depend on you, and when you desert you shirk your duty to those people. Well, first of all, if people depend on soldiers, who can soldiers depend on? That should be the government that sent them out, the government whose bidding they do. Like if war is like necessary, like then people will see that and they will go into wars. So soldiers need to be able to depend on government. The way that governments can ensure that they can is by pardoning them, this unique mechanism that Nick brings you. So kind of onto the second question, are current military justice processes enough? Like under this question, I'm also just going to do one more answer back to the theme we get up and down of gov bench of like people will mass desert. I think we kind of already beat that up and down government bench, but like just one more thing on that. Like if people are mass deserting, like which like they literally need, all of opposition bench hinges on this idea that people will mass desert. Any arguments about like sovereignty, about justice systems, about like people are relying on you depends on the fact that people will mass desert. We think in that case it's an unjust war. And this is why my partner wins this argument for you, right? Because he tells you that at this specific time, less than 1 to 3% of Americans will know someone who is in active duty service. We are completely disengaged from soldiers and war as a citizenry. This is the context that shows us why it's all the more important for soldiers to be empowered to assert themselves and to get justice for themselves, because we can no longer rely on the public to do that like we could during the Vietnam War when every person knew someone who could potentially be drafted the very next day. We are in a completely non-analogous time period that makes it uniquely important for soldiers to be able to do this. So now some direct refutation of the speech that we just get out of the closing member of opposition.
So first they say like the military justice systems like exist and soldiers can be defended well. Like first of all, Nick shows you why this isn't true when he talks to you about like the toxically masculine culture that pervades the military idea, right? So we think that deserters are likely to be perceived as weak, even if they have legitimate reasons like sexual assault, which Nick brings you, even if they have legitimate reasons like psychological harm such as PTSD, right? Nick shows you why like it's just not true that the dissenters will be treated fairly or defended well, because we don't like, first of all, the public doesn't pay enough attention to make sure they get justice, and second of all, because we see dissenters as weak rather than honorable. Like all of opposition's case hinges on the idea that we'll see dissenters as honorable. No, we think if we see dissenters as honorable, it is only after like years later looking back when we say, oh, those dissenters were right and history tells us to. By that time, they spent their entire lives in prison unjustly for something that we can agree is unjust. By the time you are able to get justice for yourself as a dissenter and not simply be seen as weak, then it is already too late, and the country has already harmed you beyond repair for giving the ultimate sacrifice, your mind, your body, your mental health. So then they give you the idea that like commanders know more than like soldiers, and people join for the wrong reasons, and they should just trust their commanders. Like this reinforces the idea that Nick brings you that like we don't value soldiers, and like you can't have both of these cases in this things in this case be true, like right? Like we can't say like, oh, inferiors like don't know best, but also we're going to defend them really well. It just doesn't work. You can't have both lines of thinking. And then they talk about like there's no consequences for deserters. Yeah, I'll take a question.
Yes, you can, because the whole point of my speech was there is a difference between the person who's deciding whether you're a genuine conscientious objector and like your dick commander in the barracks.
I just think it's honestly disrespectful to people who have put their lives on the line for their country to say that like they're making the wrong choice because they didn't know what they were getting into. I don't know if that's just my opinion, but that's how I feel. All right, so like third, they say there's no consequence for deserters. This point that they get to, like first of all, like there are consequences. The long-term psychological effects of being forced to do things that you would never have consented to do yourself. We think that Nick uniquely brings you this. It follows the line of opening government that opposition has never beat down, right? Soldiers like take the brunt of harms of war. So I think I've made it pretty clear why Nick wins this debate already, but just to spend the last minute of my speech on him. Do countries owe this to soldiers? Absolutely yes. Because soldiers give everything to countries, they say they will give their lives, and then when they say like, maybe I don't want to give my lives because I feel this is unjust, maybe I have had to endure psychological trauma that I did not expect, such as sexual assault, such as seeing my best friend in the military die right next to me. I don't want to be part of this anymore. What we tell them is like, you are weak, we wish you would have never done this for us, and we desert them. Nick gives you this point when he says like, we even desert like the honorable veterans. Like the VA is an absolute fucking disaster, and like we don't, those services, even those meager services, aren't available to people who deserted war. We think that Nick focuses the debate on the most important and vulnerable stakeholder in this debate, the soldiers themselves. He gives the necessary context as to why pardoning deserters is needed in this current moment, and he shows why the mechanism of pardoning rights the wrongs countries perpetuate against veterans and soldiers. You absolutely must vote government, and you absolutely must vote back Gov on this debate.
Okay, that speaker now called on Regis NACC to close out the debate.
Oh, someone's pen? No?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yours? Oh, it's yours?
Take someone's pen.
It's publicly shaved. Oof.
Nobody really likes war, but the house that government posits and the burden that they don't accept is that war is status quo. War happens, right? We have military intervention, and we have these kinds of war expeditions under the status quo and countries engage in them. As opposition, it is not our burden to say whether like Iraq was justified or like Vietnam was justified, to define individual wars, but just the larger conception that under the status quo, war happens, state sovereignty is important, and justifying that our state is like backing that, and the impacts of the state and the individual are important here. So like what happens for the state, what happens to the individual, and under status quo, what this motion would look like is the ideal. This motion is not how do we stop war, because that's not the model, regardless of whether you personally agree with wars in the last few years or not. And that, I think, is the biggest misconception on like opposition side, and makes a mess of burdens and kind of squirrels around when they discuss Vietnam and conscription, because that's a different idea and conception of consent. So I want to talk about the two main actors. I'll get into some like clash, and then I'm going to just characterize the round team by team, so it's very easy to kind of like judge and understand what we saw based on the constructive. Okay, so the two actors here that I think that we got a lot of analysis on. First, the state, right? We tell you on our side of the house that the state, when it admits and it says that like deserters can go off scot-free regardless of their expectations, regardless of leaving a contract, regardless of failing their state, this undermines state interest by saying, hey, there is no recourse, there is no way in which you are held accountable for failing your state, for engaging in a crime, right? This undermines state sovereignty, and it undermines the war effort that you did. So that is harmful insofar as the state and the military exercise. We also give you considerable analysis on how mass deserting occurs because you choose your own war, and no one really wants to go to war, do they? Okay, and like on the individual thing. Issue here, right? We tell you how like we get this kind of barricade referendum when like you allow people to just leave for whatever reason they want without having to justify it. And this like again, I tell you that like war is traumatic. Most people know this. They go into it with like a heavy heart and it's difficult, but because they care about their country, they martyr and they put their lives on the line, right? Like this allows them to opt out if things get uncomfortable and still get paid with no recourse. Additionally, like if you want things to be better for individual actors, whether it be sexual assault, which is a really big issue that now there are commissions on we do care about as Western liberal democracies, or you think that there are other reasons that people should be able to desert, we say then this motion should be reform military courts. If your problem is with military courts and commissions and don't think they're effective, desert them, because ultimately the impact in this round is mass desertion, state undermining, and barrack referendums. Front half.
Okay, closing opposition characterizes every soldier as somebody on the brink of deserting, and the only thing holding them back is the desertion law. This is not the case. The disincentives we gave you in the Prime Minister still exist. There are patriots who like war, who want to defend their country, they do tours, and then elect to do multiple tours afterward. Those individuals exist.
Okay, and I'm going to respond to that because I'm a good whip and I talk about every team. So I'll get to that, so thank you for reminding me of your opening case. Okay, so like, I just want to do some quick rebuttal in terms of the speech we just heard, and then I'll go team by team. Hopefully I can do this. Okay, so we get kind of two main points out of the last speaker, right? We get this legitimizes veterans when we say you can go off scot-free and it's fine, that you experience something traumatic and you don't have to go to war. We say that yes, war is trauma, but like you have a reasonable expectation of what you are going into. You are briefed on this. You can like choose not to go into it knowing the harms. But even then, just because you are traumatized and just because of your circumstance, this does not excuse the fact that you committed a crime and you can evade justice or the court system, right? Regardless of your circumstance, you still did something is wrong and there is recourse for that. And also you get better legitimization of veterans when you do your time on the field or in jail. That's a civil disobedience case that we gave you, or do it in the field. That's how you legitimize veterans for doing what they do, for actually putting their lives on the line, for doing their duty that they were contracted and agreed to do, right? And then we get the second point that soldiers should have this reasonable expectation that they'll be like defended by their government. And we say that like to some extent we can't give them all of the information sharing because recognize that like state secrets are important to not compromise massive military missions. So first off, we have to have that reasonable expectation, right? And like we are accountable, like there is recourse for this, there are military courts and like people care. But also recognize that like we have a reasonable expectation for war, but we're not asking you to commit violations of the fucking Geneva Conventions, right? We have systems and governments in the ICC and like Western liberal democracies in place that have reasonable expectations and something to you there. So I think that all falls. And also their characterization that like you have of our round of just like, you have like life in prison, like at most it's like a few years, you don't get life in prison, that's for like murder, and like that's kind of a wash. They didn't really engage in our case whatsoever. There was a fundamental lack of misunderstanding about what actually happens to deserters and what this motion will actually look like. And Dylan and I give that to you. So going team by team about this round, right? Okay, so in opening government, we get this interesting case about like conscientious objection, right? People should have the ability to do that. And we say that already exists under status quo in military courts. We also say like, they're not going, like, we're not going to violate the Geneva Conventions. What could these look like? You have that reasonable expectation. On the second point of consent, okay, large structures exist and can be predatory in the world, and like maybe reform them, like reduce poverty, do something else, like don't undermine your military in your country. What the hell? Also, like, yeah, their other point is war is traumatic. I think I dealt with that. Like, just because something's traumatic doesn't mean that you don't have to, like, you know, serve time or actually make up for that or like be public about it. Okay, on closing government, we get this case about sexual assault survivors, right? And so, like, again, this is an issue, but we say that you can reform courts, reform supports, like, you can have greater penalties for those who do it in resources, and this is already happening organically. So that's a bit of a wash, and we don't think it's actually pertinent to this motion and its impacts. So on the case on opening opposition, they give us a very interesting case about military being the key to state sovereignty and legitimacy, right? And people, like, reasonably know what to expect, and, like, war's uncomfortable. And, like, we largely agree with this, but we think that, like, it's not their burden to defend, like, war crimes and, like, specific wars, and I say that, but, like, we go a step further on closing opposition when we say that not just as, like, war something necessary to states and should not be questioned, but rather, what is the harm when, like, you undermine your, like, war by saying that anyone who deserted and was a part of it is wrong? On closing opposition, we give you this great case by mechanizing mass desertion that would basically just get ignored. Undermining state sovereignty, that gets ignored because, oh, states are bad and wars are never worth doing. We deal with reasonable consent, we deal with the public perception issue, this never gets engaged with. Ultimately, we give you these soldier referendums, choose your own war, and we talk to you about military courts. We mechanize this on our side of the house, we maintain law, and we can get better systems.